She recognized the signs of Alzheimer's in the old man's eyes, just like her grandmother's. The next morning, when the limousine stopped at her door, Sarah's worn sneakers scuffed against the concrete as she walked home from her library shift. The autumn wind picked up, making her pull her red sweatshirt tighter around her shoulders. Her phone showed 5:47 p.m. Mom would be home from a second job in about an hour. The suburban street stretched ahead, lined with identical houses and perfectly trimmed lawns. Sarah adjusted her backpack, heavy with borrowed books. The library's fluorescent lights and quiet corners had become her second home over the past year, a refuge where she could study and dream about college without worrying about the bills piling up at home. A gust of wind scattered fallen leaves across her path. That's when she saw him, an elderly man in a beige sweater, standing motionless on the sidewalk ahead. His white hair was disheveled, and his hands shook as he stared at the house numbers. Sarah's steps slowed. The man's confusion seemed familiar, the same lost look her grandmother had worn 2 years ago. Before. 42, 44. This can't be right, the man muttered, his voice trembling. Martha said. Martha. Sarah's throat tightened. She watched as the man patted his pockets, pulling out a worn leather wallet only to stare at it blankly. A group of teenagers passed by on the other side of the street. Hey, Gramps, you lost? One called out, laughing. His friends joined in with snickers and whispered comments. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She glanced around, noticing a man in a dark suit standing near a parked car, watching but doing nothing. Other pedestrians walked past, eyes averted, headphones in, phones up. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Sarah looked up at the darkening sky, then back at the elderly man. He had moved to the edge of someone's lawn, peering at their mailbox with increasing agitation. I need to. Martha will be waiting. His voice cracked. Which street is? Sarah's mother's words echoed in her head. Keep your head down. Don't get involved. You know how people look at us. The man took a stumbling step backward. His shoe caught on an uneven part of the sidewalk. Sarah's heart jumped to her throat as he wobbled, barely catching himself. I just need to. He looked around wildly, his breathing rapid and shallow. If I could just. Sarah thought of her grandmother's final days in the nursing home 3 states away. How they couldn't afford to visit more than twice that year. How she'd promised herself she'd never ignore someone who needed help, not after that. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The man's hands trembled as he tried to open his wallet again, papers slipping from his grasp to flutter in the wind. Damn kids, a woman muttered as she hurried past, clutching her purse closer. Someone should call the police. Sarah watched the elderly man chase after a fallen receipt, his movements unsteady. In the distance, more thunder rolled. The decision crystallized in her chest, solid and certain despite her racing heart. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Excuse me, sir. Sarah kept her voice gentle, hands visible at her sides. It looks like you might need some help. Are you trying to find an address? The man turned to her, his pale blue eyes clouded with confusion and fear. I need to get home. Martha's waiting. But these numbers. His voice trailed off as he gestured helplessly at the houses. My name is Sarah, she said, staying a few feet away. I live in this neighborhood. Maybe I can help you figure out where you need to go. He stared at her for a long moment, rain beginning to dot his sweater with darker spots. Robert, he finally said. Robert Wilson. But I can't seem to. It's okay, Mr. Wilson. Sarah took a small step closer, her heart still pounding but her voice steady. Let's figure this out together. The sky darkened further overhead as Sarah noticed more people gathering at a distance, watching. A police siren wailed somewhere in the distance, making Mr. Wilson jump. I don't want to bother, he started to say, his voice quavering. It's no bother, Sarah assured him, even as she felt the weight of stairs on her back. My grandmother. She sometimes needed help finding her way too. Would you mind if we looked at your wallet together? There might be something in there that could help us figure out where you live. Mr. Wilson clutched the wallet tighter for a moment, then slowly extended it toward her with trembling hands. I thought I knew. It all looked so familiar. But now. Sarah nodded encouragingly, trying to project a calm she didn't entirely feel. The rain was falling steadily now, and she could see the growing fear in Mr. Wilson's eyes as the world around him became increasingly unfamiliar. She thought of her grandmother's last days, how she'd call out for her own long-dead mother, how each familiar face had become strange to her. The memory strengthened her resolve. "We'll figure this out, Mr. Wilson," she said firmly, reaching for the wallet. Together, Sarah opened Mr. Wilson's wallet carefully, conscious of the rain starting to soak through her sweatshirt. Inside, she found several folded papers and what looked like business cards. "Sir, there are a few addresses here," she said, squinting at the wet papers. "Do any of them look familiar?" Mr. Wilson leaned closer, water dripping from his hair. I can't." His hands shook as he pointed at the papers. "They all look wrong." A small crowd had begun to gather at a distance. Sarah heard whispers and saw phones pointed in their direction. Her neck prickled with awareness. "Maybe we should get out of the rain first," she suggested, noticing how Mr. Wilson's sweater was getting soaked. "There's a bus shelter just down the block." "I don't want to go anywhere," Mr. Wilson said sharply, his voice rising. "Martha's waiting. She'll be worried." Okay, Sarah said quickly, keeping her voice calm. "We'll stay right here. Can you tell me about Martha?" His face softened slightly. "My wife. She always has dinner ready at 6. He checked his watch repeatedly. "I'm late. I'm never late." A police cruiser rolled slowly past, the officer inside watching them intently. Sarah's heart rate picked up, but she forced herself to stay focused on Mr. Wilson. "When my grandmother got confused," Sarah said quietly, "she'd tell me stories about her house." "Can you tell me about your house, Mr. Wilson? What does it look like?" He blinked rapidly, raindrops clinging to his eyelashes. There's a garden. Rose bushes. Martha loves roses." "That's good," Sarah encouraged. "What color is your house?" "White," he said immediately, then frowned. "No, blue." "Light blue." His face crumpled. I can't remember." A woman in a raincoat approached them, her umbrella held high. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her eyes fixed suspiciously on Sarah. "We're fine, thank you," Sarah replied politely, even as her stomach clenched. "I'm just helping Mr. Wilson. I should call the police," the woman interrupted, already pulling out her phone. "Just to be safe." Mr. Wilson became more agitated. "Police? No. I need to get home. Martha's waiting." He tried to step away, stumbling slightly. Sarah caught his arm gently. "It's okay, Mr. Wilson. We're going to figure this out." She turned to the woman. "Please, I'm just trying to help him get home. Let me handle this," the woman insisted. "You shouldn't be. My grandmother had Alzheimer's," Sarah cut in, her voice firm but quiet. "I know what I'm doing. Please, just let me help him." The woman hesitated, her phone still in hand. More people had stopped to watch, huddled under umbrellas or storefront awnings. Sarah turned back to the wallet, trying to ignore the growing audience. A photograph slipped from between the cards, old and worn at the edges. She caught it before the wind could take it. "Mr. Wilson, look at this," she said, holding it up. "Is this your house?" He squinted at the photograph. In it, a younger version of himself stood in front of a light blue house with a carefully tended rose garden. The house looked familiar to Sarah. She passed it many times on her way to the library. That's home," he said slowly, reaching for the photo. "Martha planted those roses when we first moved in. 20 years ago? No, more." His voice trailed off uncertainly. "I think I know this house," Sarah said, excitement building in her chest. "It's on Maple Street, isn't it?" Mr. Wilson's eyes lit up briefly. "Maple? Yes, that sounds..." Then the clarity faded, replaced by confusion. "But which way?" The rain was falling harder now. Sarah saw the woman with the phone step back, still watching them closely. Other onlookers had their own phones out, recording. A car slowed as it passed, the driver staring. "Mr. Wilson," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady despite her growing unease at the attention. "Would you like me to walk with you? I think I know where your house is." He looked at her uncertainly, clutching the photograph. You know Martha?" "No, sir, but I know the house in this picture. The one with the beautiful roses." She pointed down the street. "It's not far from here." Thunder cracked overhead, making them both jump. Mr. Wilson's face creased with worry. "Martha hates storms. She'll be looking for me." Sarah nodded. "Then let's get you home to her. Will you trust me to help?" He hesitated, looking from the photograph to Sarah's face and back again. The rain plastered his white hair to his forehead, and his sweater was now thoroughly soaked. You remind me of someone, he said slowly. A nurse? Maybe? No. He shook his head in frustration. Take your time, Sarah said gently. There's no rush. Even as she said it, she felt the weight of the stairs around them, heard the murmurs of the growing crowd. Finally, Mr. Wilson nodded. You'll help me find Martha? Yes, so we'll find her together. Sarah held out her arm, the way she used to do for her grandmother. After a moment's hesitation, Mr. Wilson took it. As they began to walk, Sarah heard the woman with the phone speaking urgently. Yes, officer, there's a situation here. She forced herself not to look back, focusing instead on keeping Mr. Wilson steady as they made their way through the rain. My grandmother used to tell me stories while we walked, Sarah said, trying to keep him calm. Would you like to hear about her? Mr. Wilson nodded absently, his grip tight on her arm. Does she like roses too? The sound of approaching footsteps made Sarah's heart skip. Heavy boots on wet pavement, steady and purposeful. She didn't need to turn around to know it was a police officer. The silence that fell over the watching crowd told her everything. Excuse me. The voice was firm, authoritative. I need you both to stop right there. Sarah felt Mr. Wilson's grip tighten on her arm. She turned slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. The officer stood a few feet away, one hand resting on his belt. Behind him, the woman with the phone watched with a satisfied expression. Good evening, officer, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. I'm helping Mr. Wilson find his way home. The officer's eyes moved between them. I've received a call about a suspicious situation. Sir, he addressed Mr. Wilson directly. Are you all right? Mr. Wilson blinked at him in confusion. I need to get home. Martha's waiting. And who is this young lady? The officer gestured to Sarah. Do you know her? She. Mr. Wilson's face creased with uncertainty. She knows about the roses. The officer frowned. Miss, I'm going to need to see some identification. Sarah's free hand moved slowly toward her backpack. My school ID is in my wallet. I volunteer at the library on Oak Street. I was walking home when I found Mr. Wilson. He seemed confused, and I recognized the signs because my grandmother had Alzheimer's. Hands where I can see them, the officer instructed as she reached for her bag. Move slowly. The rain continued to fall steadily. Sarah could feel Mr. Wilson trembling beside her. Whether from cold or fear, she wasn't sure. More people had gathered despite the weather, watching the scene unfold. That's far enough, a sharp voice called out. An older white woman pushed through the crowd. I've already called the real police. This girl was trying to lead him somewhere. I am the real police, the officer replied, but his hand hadn't moved from his belt. Please step back and let me handle this. Sarah's fingers shook as she pulled out her wallet, water dripping from her soaked sleeves. Here's my ID. I'm 16. I live 3 blocks from here with my mom. Please, I just want to help Mr. Wilson get home. He lives in the blue house on Maple Street, the one with the rose garden. How do you know where he lives? The officer asked. The photograph, Sarah explained, pointing to the picture Mr. Wilson still clutched. I recognize the house. I pass it every day on my way to the library. Thunder rumbled overhead. Mr. Wilson jumped, his grip on Sarah's arm becoming painful. Martha, he muttered. Martha hates storms. I need to. Sir, the officer addressed Mr. Wilson again. Do you want to go with this young lady? Mr. Wilson looked confused, his eyes darting between Sarah and the officer. She knows about the roses. Like the nurse. No, not the nurse. His free hand pressed against his forehead. I can't remember. Maybe we should call an ambulance, someone in the crowd suggested. No. Mr. Wilson's voice rose sharply. No hospitals. Martha's waiting. She'll worry. Sarah felt tears of frustration building behind her eyes, but she blinked them away. Officer, please. The longer we stand here in the rain, the more upset Mr. Wilson gets. I know where his house is. It's not far. The officer studied her for a long moment. You said your grandmother had Alzheimer's? Yes, so she lived with us for a while before. Sarah swallowed hard. Before we couldn't take care of her anymore. I know how scary and confusing everything can seem. I just want to help. The officer's radio crackled. He stepped away to respond, speaking in low tones. Sarah used the moment to turn to Mr. Wilson. Are you cold, Mr. Wilson? We'll get you home soon. I promise. He nodded, still clutching the photograph. The roses. Martha will be upset if the storm damages the roses. I'm sure they'll be fine, Sarah assured him, even as she felt her own clothes growing heavier with rain. Martha probably covered them up when she saw the storm coming. The officer returned, his expression slightly softer. I've called in. There's a report of a missing elderly man matching Mr. Wilson's description. His son filed it about an hour ago. Relief flooded through Sarah. Then you know I'm telling the truth? Can we take him home now? I'll escort you both, the officer said. Which way to Maple Street? Before Sarah could answer, Mr. Wilson suddenly pulled away from her. No, this is wrong. You're all wrong. His voice rose in panic. Martha! He tried to turn, to run, but his feet slipped on the wet sidewalk. Sarah lunged forward, catching his arm before he could fall. The officer moved quickly to his other side. It's okay, Mr. Wilson, Sarah said urgently. Remember the roses? Remember the photograph? We're going to take you to Martha. The roses, he repeated, his breathing ragged. Yes, the roses. But how do I know? How do I know this is real? The woman who had called the police stepped forward again. See? She's upsetting him. You need to. The officer cut her off firmly. Please step back and let us handle this. Sarah felt Mr. Wilson's grip on her arm loosen slightly. She pulled the photograph from his clenched fingers and held it up. Look, Mr. Wilson. This is your house. See the blue mailbox? And the rose bushes along the front walk. Martha planted those. Remember? You told me about it. His eyes focused on the photograph. Yes, she did. 20 years ago. Or was it? That's right, Sarah encouraged. And we're going to go there now. The officer will come with us, just to make sure everything's okay. Is that all right? Mr. Wilson looked at her, then at the officer, then back at the photograph. The panic in his eyes slowly receded. You'll help me find Martha? Yes, so we all will. Sarah glanced at the officer, who nodded. Okay, Mr. Wilson said quietly. Okay. The crowd began to disperse as the officer radioed in their location and direction. Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, even as the rain continued to fall. This way, she said gently, turning Mr. Wilson toward Maple Street. Let's get you home to Martha. The rain fell in heavy sheets now, turning the suburban streets into shallow rivers. Sarah kept a steady grip on Mr. Wilson's arm as they walked, the police officer following close behind. Their shoes splashed through puddles, each step sending up tiny sprays of water. Watch the curb here, Mr. Wilson, Sarah warned, guiding him carefully over the uneven pavement. It's a bit high. Mr. Wilson nodded absently, his wet sweater hanging heavy on his thin frame. Martha, she'll have the heat on. She always knows when I'm cold. The officer's radio crackled again. Dispatch, this is Officer Matthews. We're heading east on Oak toward Maple Street. ETA about 10 minutes. Sarah's teeth chattered slightly from the cold, but she kept talking, trying to keep Mr. Wilson engaged. Tell me more about Martha. So how long have you been married? 53 years, he said, then stopped walking abruptly. Or is it 40? I can't. Everything's getting mixed up again. That's okay, Sarah assured him quickly. The important thing is that we're getting closer to home. See that big oak tree ahead? That means we're almost to Maple Street. A car drove past, its headlights cutting through the rain and illuminating their small group. The driver slowed down, staring. Sarah felt Mr. Wilson tense beside her. Those lights, he muttered. Like the hospital. They kept the lights on all night. I told Martha I didn't want to go back there. No hospitals, Sarah promised. We're just walking home in the rain. Remember the photograph? With the roses. His free hand patted his pocket where the photograph was safely tucked away. Yes, the roses. But what if they're not there anymore? What if everything's changed? Officer Matthews stepped closer. Sir, would you like to take a break? We could wait under that storefront awning. Mr. Wilson shook his head violently. No more waiting. Martha's alone. She forgets things sometimes too. She needs me. Sarah's heart clenched at his words. She glanced at the officer, who nodded for them to continue. They turned onto Maple Street, the wind driving the rain sideways now. Sarah blinked water from her eyes, scanning the houses. Something felt wrong. In the darkness and rain, all the buildings looked different. I thought. She started, then stopped. The houses blurred together, their familiar features distorted by the storm. Problem? Officer Matthews asked quietly. Sarah swallowed hard. The rain? It's making it hard to see. But I know it's on this street. I pass it every day. Mr. Wilson's grip on her arm tightened painfully. You said you knew. You promised. I do know, Sarah said quickly. We just need to walk a little further. The roses will tell us which house is yours. They continued down the street, Sarah's heart pounding harder with each house they passed. None of them looked quite right. The rain transformed the neat suburban homes into looming shadows. A crack of thunder made them all jump. Mr. Wilson let out a small cry. Martha hates thunder, he said, his voice rising. She'll be looking for me. She'll be at the window. But which window? Which house? Sir, please stay calm, Officer Matthews said. We're going to figure this out. A porch light flicked on ahead of them, and a door opened. An elderly woman peered out into the rain. Robert, she called. Is that you? Mr. Wilson stopped walking. That sounds like... Martha, Sarah asked hopefully, but Mr. Wilson was already shaking his head. No, that's not her voice. That's not right. He tried to pull away from Sarah. Nothing's right. The woman on the porch stepped back inside and closed the door. Sarah felt a wave of disappointment wash over her. Maybe we should call his son, Officer Matthews suggested. Get an exact address. No. Mr. Wilson's voice cracked. No more phones. No more people. I just want Martha. I just want to go home. Sarah wiped rain from her face with her free hand. Mr. Wilson, can we look at the photograph again? Maybe it will help us remember which house is yours. His hand shook as he pulled the wet photograph from his pocket. The paper had gone soft, the image blurring slightly, but the blue house was still visible. See the distinctive mailbox? Sarah pointed. And the way the rose bushes are arranged? We just need to find that pattern. They started walking again, slower now, studying each house they passed. The rain made it difficult to see clearly, but Sarah forced herself to focus on the details. The shape of the bushes, the color of the paint, the style of the mailbox. A dog barked somewhere in the darkness, making Mr. Wilson startle. Timothy's dog, he muttered. Always barking at night. Sarah's steps slowed. Timothy? Is he your neighbor, Mr. Wilson? Next door, he said vaguely. Martha brings him cookies. No, brought him cookies. He moved away. Or did we move? I can't. That's okay, Sarah said gently. The memory about Timothy is helpful. Do you remember which side he lived on? Left or right? Mr. Wilson's face scrunched in concentration. Left? No, right. The dog would bark at Martha's roses. Officer Matthews moved his flashlight beam along the row of houses. Look for any signs of rose bushes. They might be covered for the storm, but we should still be able to see the basic layout. Sarah squinted through the rain. 2 houses ahead, she caught a glimpse of something familiar. A series of shapes under dark tarps, arranged in a distinctive pattern along a front walk. There, she said excitedly. Mr. Wilson, look, are those your rose bushes? Martha must have covered them before the storm. They moved closer, and Sarah's heart began to race. The house was light blue, just like in the photograph. The mailbox, though wet and shadowy, had the same unique design. Mr. Wilson stared at the house, his expression uncertain. It looks... A shadow moved behind one of the front windows. A moment later, the porch light came on, and the front door opened. An elderly woman stood there, her silver hair neatly styled despite the late hour. She wore a cardigan and held a phone in her hand. Robert? Her voice quavered slightly. Robert, is that you? Mr. Wilson's whole body went still. Martha. Martha Wilson stepped onto the covered porch, her hand gripping the doorframe. Oh, thank God. I've been calling everyone. The police, the neighbors. Her voice broke off as she noticed Sarah and Officer Matthews. What happened? Is he hurt? Before anyone could answer, Mr. Wilson suddenly pulled away from Sarah's grip. No, this isn't right. This isn't. His voice rose in panic. The roses are wrong. They're covered up. This isn't our house. Robert, honey, of course it's our house, Martha said, taking a step forward. I covered the roses because of the storm. Remember? We talked about it at breakfast. Mr. Wilson backed away, almost slipping on the wet grass. No, no. Martha wouldn't cover the roses. She loves to see them in the rain. You're not Martha. Officer Matthews moved quickly to steady him. Sir, please calm down. You're safe. Sarah's soaked clothes felt like lead weights, but she forced herself to focus. Mr. Wilson, look at the photograph again. Look at the house. It's the same, even if the roses are covered right now. I can't. Mr. Wilson pressed his hands against his temples. Everything's wrong. The lights, the sounds, nothing makes sense anymore. Martha descended the porch steps into the rain, her movements careful but determined. Robert, remember what Dr. Stevens said? When things get confusing, we need to focus on one thing at a time. Dr. Stevens? Mr. Wilson's voice wavered. The memory doctor? That's right, Martha said softly. We saw him last Tuesday. He gave you those new pills to help on bad days. Sarah watched as Mr. Wilson's face contorted with effort. Tuesday, but today is. I can't remember what day it is. Why can't I remember? It's okay not to remember everything, Martha said, moving closer. What matters is you're home now. See the mailbox? You painted it blue last summer because you said it matched my eyes. Mr. Wilson turned to look at the mailbox, then back at Martha. Blue? Yes, I remember the paint. It dripped on my shoes. His hand reached out uncertainly. But you look different. I changed my hair last week, Martha explained patiently. Remember? You said it made me look like that actress from the old movies we watch. Lauren Bacall, Mr. Wilson whispered. You always loved her movies. Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as recognition flickered in Mr. Wilson's eyes. Officer Matthews maintained his steady grip but also seemed to relax slightly. Then a car turned onto the street, its headlights sweeping across them. Mr. Wilson jerked away from the light, stumbling backward. No, the hospital had lights like that. They kept shining them in my eyes, asking questions I couldn't answer. His breathing became rapid and shallow. I won't go back there. I won't. Nobody's taking you to the hospital, Sarah said quickly. The car's just passing by. Look, it's already gone. Martha stepped closer, her clothes now as wet as theirs. Robert, remember our first date? You took me to that little Italian restaurant downtown. Angelo's. You ordered spaghetti and got sauce all over your new tie. Mr. Wilson's panic seemed to pause. Angelo's, red checkered tablecloths. That's right, Martha smiled. And you were so embarrassed about the tie that you didn't notice you had sauce on your chin too. I thought it was adorable. You helped me clean it off, Mr. Wilson said slowly. Used your own napkin. Said it was a good excuse to hold my hand across the table. Sarah watched as Martha moved even closer, close enough now to touch him. And we've been holding hands ever since, haven't we, dear? Mr. Wilson stared at her outstretched hand. 53 years, he said, his voice stronger now. We've been married 53 years. That's right, Martha confirmed. Through better and worse. Just like we promised. The roses, Mr. Wilson said suddenly. You really covered them because of the storm. Of course. You helped me pick out these tarps last month at the hardware store. Remember? You said the black ones would look less obvious than the blue ones I wanted. Mr. Wilson reached out slowly and touched one of the covered bushes. I did say that, didn't I? Because you worry about what the neighbors think about the garden. I do, Martha admitted with a small laugh. Too much, probably. But you never mind. You just smile and help me make everything perfect. Officer Matthews spoke softly to Sarah. I think we can let go now. Are you okay to stay until we're sure? Sarah nodded, her own arms aching from the strain of the last hour. She watched as Mr. Wilson finally took Martha's offered hand. Your fingers are cold, he said, sounding surprised. Because I've been standing in the rain, silly man, Martha replied, her voice thick with emotion. Waiting for you to come home to me. Mr. Wilson looked around, seeming to truly see their surroundings for the first time. We're all wet. Why are we standing in the rain? Because you got a little lost, Martha explained gently. But this young lady and this nice officer helped you find your way back. Mr. Wilson turned to look at Sarah, confusion crossing his face again. I know you, don't I? Something about roses. Sarah smiled despite her chattering teeth. You showed me a photograph of your house. The one with the beautiful rose garden that Martha planted. The photograph. Mr. Wilson patted his pockets frantically. Where? Right here. So Sarah carefully extracted the wet photograph from where he'd tucked it earlier. See? This is your house. We found it, just like I promised. Mr. Wilson took the photograph with trembling fingers. Yes, I remember now. You said your grandmother had Alzheimer's, like you, Sarah finished quietly. That's how I knew you needed help. Alzheimer's, Mr. Wilson repeated, the word coming out like a sigh. The doctor said, he said there would be bad days. Was this a bad day? Martha squeezed his hand. It doesn't matter now, dear. You're home. Let's get you inside and into some dry clothes. A gust of wind drove the rain sideways, making everyone on the lawn flinch. Martha tugged gently on Mr. Wilson's hand. Come inside, dear. You're soaked through. Mr. Wilson took a hesitant step toward the house, then stopped. But the girl and the officer, they're coming too, Martha assured him. Just for a moment, to make sure you're settled. She looked at Sarah and Officer Matthews. Please, you both must come in. You're as wet as he is. The warmth of the house hit Sarah like a wave as they stepped inside. The entryway light illuminated family photos on the walls, a worn welcome mat, and an umbrella stand by the door. Everything neat, everything in its place. Robert, let's get you out of that wet sweater, Martha said, helping Mr. Wilson with the soaked garment. Officer, there are some clean towels in the hall closet, if you wouldn't mind. Officer Matthews nodded and retrieved the towels, handing one to Sarah. She dabbed at her dripping hair, trying not to shiver too obviously. The living room's through here, Martha directed, leading Mr. Wilson down the hallway. Sarah, come sit down before you catch your death. The living room looked like something from an old movie, floral wallpaper, comfortable furniture, and more family photos everywhere. A TV played quietly in the corner, showing what looked like a weather report. I should call this in, Officer Matthews said, touching his radio. Let them know Mr. Wilson's been found safe. Mr. Wilson's head snapped up at the word safe. Found? Was I lost? Martha sat him in a worn armchair, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. Just a little turned around, dear. But everything's fine now. I need to get your statement, Officer Matthews told Martha quietly. And we should probably call your son. Let him know his father's home. Sarah watched as Mr. Wilson's expression shifted from confusion to something like shame. Michael? You called Michael's. He was worried about you, Martha said, smoothing his wet hair back from his forehead. He's been helping look for you. I don't remember leaving, Mr. Wilson admitted, his voice small. Everything's fuzzy, like trying to see through fog. A phone rang somewhere in the house. Martha touched Mr. Wilson's shoulder. That's probably Michael now. Officer, would you mind coming with me to the kitchen? We can talk there. As they left the room, Sarah stood awkwardly by the doorway, unsure if she should follow. But Mr. Wilson spoke up suddenly. You knew about the roses, he said, looking at her with clearer eyes than he'd had all evening. That's how you knew this was home. Sarah nodded. The photograph helped. And you told me about Martha planting them 20 years ago. 53 years, he corrected, then frowned. No, that's how long we've been married. The roses came later, after Michael was born. He pressed his hands against his temples. It's so hard to keep things straight sometimes. My grandmother was the same way, Sarah said, taking a careful seat on the couch. Some days were better than others. Mr. Wilson lowered his hands. Your grandmother? You mentioned her before. When we were walking. Yes, so she had Alzheimer's too. She lived with us for a while. Lived, he repeated. Past tense. She's gone now, Sarah finished quietly. 2 years ago. Mr. Wilson was silent for a moment, staring at his hands. I'm sorry. About earlier. Getting so confused. Scared. You were just trying to help. You don't need to apologize, Mr. Wilson. I'm just glad we found your way home. From the kitchen, they could hear Martha's voice. Yes, Michael is safe. A young girl helped him. No, I don't know how long he was out there. Mr. Wilson's shoulders hunched. I'm causing so much trouble. For Martha, for Michael, for strangers on the street. That's not true, Sarah said firmly. You're not causing trouble. You're dealing with something difficult. But you have people who care about you, who want to help, like you helped. He looked at her with sudden clarity. Even though some people thought you shouldn't. Sarah swallowed hard, remembering the suspicious stares, the woman with the phone. Sometimes people make assumptions, but that doesn't mean you should stop doing what's right. Martha returned to the living room, Officer Matthews behind her. Michael's on his way, she announced. He wants to thank you personally, Sarah. Oh, that's not necessary, Sarah started to say, but Martha cut her off gently. Please stay, just until he gets here. I'm making some hot chocolate. And I think I have some cookies left from Sunday's baking. Mr. Wilson perked up slightly. Snickerdoodles? Martha smiled. Your favorite. You helped me roll them in cinnamon sugar. Remember? Pie. I think so, he said slowly. The kitchen smelled good all afternoon. Officer Matthews cleared his throat. I need to get back on patrol, but I'll file my report about the incident. Mrs. Wilson has my card if you need anything. He turned to Sarah. You did good work tonight, young lady. Not everyone would have stopped to help. As the officer left, Martha disappeared into the kitchen again. Sarah heard the clink of mugs, the rustle of a cookie tin. Tell me about your grandmother, Mr. Wilson said suddenly. If you don't mind. Sometimes it helps to hear about others who. He gestured vaguely at his head. Sarah shifted on the couch. She was a teacher. Elementary school. Even after she got sick, she would try to teach us things. Mixed up the lessons sometimes. Taught us multiplication tables in French. She smiled at the memory. We didn't have the heart to tell her none of us spoke French. Was it hard? Mr. Wilson asked softly. Watching her change. Yes, Sarah admitted. But she was still her. Still loved us. Still tried to take care of us in her own way. Even when she couldn't remember our names, she remembered how we liked our toast, or which stories we loved to hear. Martha returned with a tray of steaming mugs and a plate of cookies. Here we are. Careful. The chocolate's hot. Mr. Wilson took a cookie, studied it carefully. Sunday afternoon, he said firmly. We baked on Sunday afternoon. You wore your blue apron, the one with the flour stains that won't come out. That's right, Martha beamed. See? You remember the important things. The sound of car doors slamming came from outside. Martha looked up. That'll be Michael. Mr. Wilson's hand trembled slightly as he set down his cookie. He'll be upset, having to come out in the rain. So late. He'll just be happy you're safe, Sarah said. That's what family cares about. Heavy footsteps approached the front door. Martha squeezed her husband's shoulder before going to answer it. Sarah heard murmured voices in the hallway, then new footsteps approaching the living room. Dad! A tall man in a business suit appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and his hair damp from the rain. Are you okay? Mr. Wilson looked up at his son, his expression a mix of recognition and uncertainty. Michael, you didn't have to come. It's late. Michael Wilson crossed the room in 3 quick strides, kneeling beside his father's chair. Of course I had to come. We've been looking everywhere for you. What happened? Mr. Wilson's face creased with effort. I was trying to get home. But the numbers, nothing looked right. Martha touched Michael's shoulder. He's safe now. That's what matters. She gestured toward Sarah. Thanks to this young lady. Michael turned, seeming to notice Sarah for the first time. His expensive suit and commanding presence made her feel even more aware of her soaked clothes and dripping hair. You're the one who helped my father. Sarah nodded. I found him on Oak Street. He seemed confused, so I. She knew about the roses, Mr. Wilson interrupted. Like her grandmother. The one who got lost in the fog too. Michael's expression softened slightly. The police mentioned someone had helped, but they didn't give many details. How did you know where to bring him? The photograph in his wallet, Sarah explained. I recognized the house. I passed by here often on my way to the library. You walked him home? In this weather? Michael stood, his height making Sarah shrink back slightly into the couch. That was quite a risk to take. For both of you. Martha made a disapproving sound. Michael, she helped your father when others just walked by. Some even called the police on her. Call the police? Michael's eyebrows rose. Why would they? He stopped, understanding crossing his face. Oh. Sarah looked down at her hands. It's okay. The officer who responded was very understanding once I explained. Still, Michael said, his voice tight. The fact that anyone would assume. He shook his head. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Especially while trying to help. Mr. Wilson spoke up again, his voice clearer than before. She stayed, even when people stared, even when they said things. He looked at Sarah. Like you did with your grandmother. You stayed. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Sometimes that's all you can do. Just stay. Martha wiped at her eyes with the corner of her apron. Would anyone like more hot chocolate? Michael. No, thank you, Mom. Michael checked his watch. It's getting late. I should probably take Sarah home. Her family must be worried. Sarah's heart jumped. Her mom would be home from work by now, probably wondering where she was. Oh no, I didn't even think to call. I'll drive you, Michael insisted. It's the least I can do. Where do you live? Just a few blocks away, on Elm Street. But you don't have to, please. He cut her off gently. Let me do this small thing. After what you did for my father. Mr. Wilson stirred in his chair. You're leaving? A note of anxiety crept into his voice. Just for a little while, dear, Martha assured him. To take Sarah home. Then Michael will come back to check on you. But Mr. Wilson reached for the cookie plate with trembling hands. We didn't finish the snickerdoodles. Sarah smiled despite the lump in her throat. Maybe I could come back another time? If that's okay. Martha touched her husband's shoulder. That's a wonderful idea. You could tell her more about the roses. On a day when they are not covered up. The roses, Mr. Wilson repeated. Yes, you should see them properly. When the sun is out. They are red, you know. Like your sweater. Sarah looked down at her soaked red sweatshirt. I'd like that very much, Mr. Wilson. Michael gathered his car keys. Ready to go? Mom, I'll be back in 20 minutes or so. Take your time, Martha said, helping Mr. Wilson with his hot chocolate. Your father and I will be fine. We'll get him into some dry clothes and maybe watch a bit of TV before bed. Sarah stood, her legs stiff from sitting in wet clothes. As she followed Michael toward the door, Mr. Wilson called out. Wait! They turned back. He was half out of his chair, Martha's hand on his arm. Your name? I want to remember your name. Sarah, she said softly. Sarah Johnson. Sarah, he repeated carefully. Sarah who knows about roses and fog and staying. He nodded to himself. I'll remember. In the entrance hall, Michael helped Sarah with her wet backpack. Martha appeared with an umbrella. Take this, she insisted. It's still pouring out there. Thank you, Mrs. Wilson, for the hot chocolate and cookies. Martha pulled her into a sudden hug. Thank you, dear, for bringing him home. The drive to Sarah's house was quiet at first, just the sound of rain on the car roof and wipers scraping across the windshield. Michael's BMW smelled of leather and some expensive cologne. My father's condition, he finally said, it's been getting worse lately. More confused episodes, more wandering. Mom tries to watch him, but it's hard, Sarah finished. You can't watch every minute. Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel. We've talked about getting help. A home health aide, maybe. But Dad resists the idea. And Mom, she wants to keep taking care of him herself. My mom was the same way with my grandmother, Sarah said. Until it became too much. Sarah nodded, watching raindrops race down the car window. We couldn't afford proper care at home. And after she fell that third time, they turned onto Elm Street. Which house? Michael asked. The brown one, there, with the porch light on. He pulled up to the curb. Through the rain-streaked windows, Sarah could see her mother's silhouette in the front window, probably watching for her. Sarah, Michael said as she reached for the door handle. What you did tonight, running into my father, could have gone very differently. If you hadn't stopped, if you hadn't cared enough to help. I just did what I hoped someone would do for my grandmother, Sarah said quietly. What I wish I could have done for her. At the end, Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. Take this. My personal number's on the back. If you ever need anything, a recommendation for college, an internship, anything, call me. Sarah took the card, tucking it carefully into her backpack. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Michael, please. He smiled slightly. And the offer about visiting Dad stands. It would mean a lot to him. To all of us. Sarah's mom opened the front door, light spilling onto the wet porch. I should go. She'll be worried. Of course. And Sarah? She paused with her hand on the door. Thank you for staying. Sarah's mom was waiting just inside the door, her work uniform still on, worry lines creasing her forehead. "Sarah? Where have you been?" "I've been calling." She stopped, taking in Sarah's soaked clothes and the expensive car at the curb. "What happened?" "Mom, I'm sorry I didn't call. I was helping someone, and it took longer than I expected." Sarah stepped inside, dripping on the worn welcome mat. "Let me change, and I'll explain everything." Her mom's eyes narrowed at the car still idling outside. "Who brought you home?" "That's Michael Wilson. His father was lost in the rain, and I helped him get home." Sarah peeled off her wet sweatshirt. "It's kind of a long story." 10 minutes later, wearing dry clothes and wrapped in a blanket on their small couch, Sarah told her mother everything. About finding Mr. Wilson, the suspicious onlookers, the police officer, and finally getting him home safely. Her mom's expression shifted from concern to understanding. "You thought about Grandma?" "Yeah," Sarah admitted, pulling the blanket tighter. "When I saw him standing there, confused, I couldn't just walk by." Her mom was quiet for a moment, then stood and went to the kitchen. Sarah heard the familiar sounds of tea being made, her mom's solution to every crisis, big or small. "Some people would have walked by," her mom finally said, returning with 2 steaming mugs. "Would have decided it wasn't their problem. Like with Grandma." Sarah took the offered tea. "When she used to wander around the neighborhood, and people would just pretend not to see her." Her mom's voice was tight. "Yes, like that." They sat in silence for a while, sipping tea and listening to the rain against the windows. Finally, her mom spoke again. "You said his son drove you home? In that fancy car?" "Yeah. He's some kind of businessman. Gave me his card. Said to call if I ever need anything." Her mom's eyebrows rose. "May I see it?" Sarah retrieved the slightly damp card from her backpack. Her mom's eyes widened as she read it. "Sarah, this man is the CEO of Wilson Technologies. They're one of the biggest employers in the state." "Oh." Sarah stared at her tea. "That explains the suit, I guess." Her mom handed the card back carefully. "Keep it safe. An opportunity like that, it could mean something for your future." Sarah was about to respond when headlights swept across their front window again. Both women looked up as a sleek black car pulled up to their curb. "Is that a limousine?" her mom asked, standing to peer through the curtains. Before Sarah could answer, there was a knock at their door. Her mom smoothed her uniform and opened it to find a tall man in a chauffeur's uniform. "Miss Sarah Johnson?" he asked politely. Sarah stood, still clutching her blanket. "Yes, Mr. Michael Wilson sends his regards and this." He held out a thick envelope. "He also asked me to deliver this message. Some things shouldn't wait until morning." Sarah's mom accepted the envelope with slightly shaking hands. The chauffeur tipped his hat and returned to the waiting limousine. "Open it," her mom urged, closing the door. Sarah carefully broke the seal. Inside was a letter on expensive stationery, along with what looked like several documents. "Dear Sarah," she read aloud. "After leaving you tonight, I returned to my parents' house and had a long talk with my father. In his more lucid moments, he spoke about your kindness, about how you reminded him of his own mother who suffered from the same condition. He also spoke about your grandmother, and how you weren't able to be with her at the end due to financial constraints." Sarah's voice wavered. Her mom sat beside her, one arm around her shoulders. "Keep reading," she encouraged softly. "What you did tonight wasn't just about getting my father home safely. It was about dignity, about seeing the person behind the confusion. In honor of both your grandmother and your compassion, I've established a scholarship fund in your name at the state university. It will cover full tuition and expenses for students pursuing degrees in social work or elder care, with preference given to those who have been personally affected by Alzheimer's disease." Sarah's hands shook as she looked at the other papers, legal documents detailing the scholarship fund, already signed and notarized. "There's more," her mom said, pointing to the letter. "Additionally, I've arranged for an internship position for you at our company's charitable foundation, starting next summer if you're interested. Your insight and empathy would be valuable assets to our community outreach programs." Sarah lowered the letter, her vision blurring with tears. "Mom, Her mom pulled her close. "You did a good thing, baby. A really good thing. I just wanted to help him get home. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the biggest ripples." Her mom wiped her own eyes. "Your grandmother would be so proud." Sarah looked at the documents again, reality slowly sinking in. Does this mean I can actually go to college? Really go? Not just hope and pray for enough scholarships. Looks like it does. Her mom picked up the business card from where it lay on the coffee table. And it means you've got some powerful people in your corner now. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number. Dad's asking if you can come see the roses this weekend. Weather report says sun. Michael, another message followed quickly. Mom's making more snickerdoodles. Sarah smiled through her tears. Mr. Wilson remembered. Of course he did, her mom said softly. Some things stick in the heart, even when the mind gets foggy. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Sarah went to the window and looked out at the clearing sky, thinking about rose gardens and the strange ways life could change in a single evening. Her phone buzzed again. And Sarah? Thank you for staying. The weekend arrived with perfect spring weather, just as predicted. Sarah stood outside the Wilsons' house, looking at the uncovered rose bushes in the morning light. They were even more beautiful than she'd imagined, their red petals still holding drops of dew. Right on time, Martha called from the porch. Robert's been watching the clock since sunrise. Come in, dear. Inside, the house felt different in daylight. Warmer, more lived in. Family photos seemed to tell stories from every wall. Graduations, weddings, holidays, a lifetime of memories preserved in frames. Mr. Wilson sat in his chair by the window, already dressed in slacks and a cardigan despite the early hour. His face lit up when he saw her. Sarah. He started to rise. You came to see the roses. I did, Mr. Wilson. She smiled, noticing how much steadier he seemed today. They are beautiful. Martha planted them, he said proudly, then paused. But you knew that already, didn't you? From the other night. That's right. Sarah sat on the couch across from him. You told me about them while we were walking in the rain. He nodded slowly. Sometimes things get mixed up in my head. But I remember you. You stayed when others walked away. Martha appeared with a plate of fresh cookies and coffee. He's been having more good days lately. The new medication seems to be helping. And the home health aide, Mr. Wilson added, surprising Sarah. Margaret comes in the afternoons now. She's teaching Martha it's okay to take breaks. Michael arranged it, Martha explained, pouring coffee. After what happened, well, we all realized we needed a little help. Mr. Wilson reached for a cookie. Tell me about your grandmother again. The memories, they are a bit fuzzy. Sarah settled back into the couch. She was a teacher, 3rd grade. She loved roses too, but she could never get them to grow right. Needed the right soil, Mr. Wilson said decisively. And timing with the seasons. Martha knows all about that. They spent the morning talking about roses and teaching and memories both clear and clouded. Mr. Wilson had moments of confusion, but they passed like clouds across the sun, his clarity returning each time. Around noon, Michael arrived with takeout lunch. Hope you don't mind Chinese food, Sarah. Dad loves their dumplings. They ate in the living room, sharing stories and laughing. Mr. Wilson told tales from Michael's childhood, only sometimes mixing up the dates and details. Martha gently corrected him when needed, their teamwork obvious and touching. Sarah starts her internship next week, Michael mentioned during a lull in conversation. The foundation's excited to have her. Mr. Wilson put down his chopsticks. Foundation. Remember, Dad? The scholarship we set up? Sarah's going to help other families dealing with Alzheimer's. Scholarship. Mr. Wilson's face scrunched in concentration. Then his eyes cleared. Yes, because she helped me find my way home. Through the fog. Sarah touched the acceptance letter in her pocket, her ticket to college, to a future she'd barely dared to dream about. Actually, Mr. Wilson, you helped me too. I did. He looked puzzled. You reminded me that sometimes the hardest step is just staying. Not walking away when things get difficult. Martha wiped her eyes with a napkin. Robert, why don't you show Sarah your memory book? The one Dr. Stevens suggested we make. Mr. Wilson brightened. Yes, it's on the shelf. The blue album. The book was filled with labeled photographs, important dates, and little notes about daily routines. On the newest page, Sarah saw a familiar image, the photograph from his wallet, now carefully preserved. Michael helped me add this, Mr. Wilson said, pointing to a note beside the photo. So I won't forget. Sarah read the carefully printed words. Sarah Johnson helped me find my way home on a rainy night. She knows about roses and fog and staying. She reminds me of Mom. Your mother had it too? Sarah asked gently. Mr. Wilson nodded. Near the end. That's why. He looked at Michael. That's why the scholarship is so important. To help others stay. Speaking of staying, Martha said, Margaret will be here soon. But Sarah, you'll come back to visit. Of course. Sarah stood, gathering her things. Someone needs to make sure these roses stay properly tended. Mr. Wilson walked her to the door, his steps careful but steady. You know, he said, pausing at the threshold, some days I might not remember your name, or why I know you. That's okay, Mr. Wilson. But I'll remember this feeling. He touched his chest. The feeling of someone choosing to stay. That doesn't get lost in the fog. Outside, the roses bloomed in the spring sunshine. Sarah thought about her grandmother, about choices and changes and the strange ways love could echo through generations. Next time, Mr. Wilson called after her, Bring your mother. Martha's teaching me to bake snickerdoodles. Everyone should know how to make something that makes people smile. Sarah waved goodbye, her heart full. As she walked home, she passed other houses, other gardens, other lives unfolding behind closed doors. She thought about all the people out there, lost in their own kinds of fog, waiting for someone to stay. Her phone buzzed, a reminder about her first foundation meeting next week. They would be discussing programs for families affected by Alzheimer's, ways to help both patients and caregivers navigate the fog together. At the corner, Sarah paused and looked back. Mr. Wilson still stood in his doorway, Martha beside him, both waving. The roses bloomed red and proud along their walk, a living reminder that even in the midst of forgetting, some things remained. Love, kindness, the courage to stay. Behind her house key, Sarah now carried a copy of the Wilsons' front door key. For emergencies, Martha had insisted. But it felt like more than that. It felt like belonging, like family, like proof that sometimes the smallest choice to help could bloom into something beautiful. Like roses after rain.